Thanks everyone for having me. I'm really excited to be here and talk with all of you guys. As Coco said, I'm an artist, but I have a background in environmental studies and specifically natural resource management. I studied as an undergrad at the University of Vermont, and my major was natural resource management. I worked in land conservation for a few years after college, but was always an artist. I always painted. I always liked doing creative projects and kind of found myself coming back to school for the arts. And with that, was always also really interested and passionate about how I could find ways to integrate my interest in the environment and climate change with my passion for making things and what I believe art's ability to kind of bring people in on an emotional level. At my school, as a natural resource management major, I couldn't take studio art classes, which was like forever, still to this day, has bothered me so much. But I almost feel like that kind of red tape around the departments in my school has really inspired me to try to find ways to do that, creative ways to do that. So without further ado, I will start my talk with a short video clip. And I will just preface it by saying I'm an artist, and I also really love science, and I also really like science fiction. So some of you guys might recognize this clip.
Right, I'll see you shortly. There's a meteorite that hit the ground near here. I want to check it out. It won't take long. Steady, girl. What's the matter?
So sadly, we're not going to watch all of Return of the Jedi right now. But I wanted to show this clip because there's something to me about science fiction that has always held such, I've always been really fascinated with it. And I think part of that is with fantasy and science fiction, we're drawn to these really harsh landscapes. We're drawn to the stories of the people that they are about. And also, science fiction can use science in a really smart way. Like a lot of science fiction movies are actually using science that's real, that's been proven, but then adding a human element into that to really draw people in. So science fiction is this weird love I have that I keep coming back to over and over about like, why am I so interested in this thing and what devices can we use that science fiction uses to help talk about landscape, to talk about the environment, and to really bring people on board with some of these issues. So a lot of questions emerge for me, like who tells our stories, who creates truth, and how can we get people to care about science the way that people care about science fiction? And so one of these ideas that's embedded in all of these stories about science fiction and fantasy is this idea of an expedition, an adventure, or a journey. And that's something that I've always been interested in. As someone who studied natural resources, part of the draw to me of working in conservation was, yes, to do good things for the environment, but also this promise of going out in the field, being an explorer, going out in the pursuit of scientific exploration. There was always this really romantic idea to me of what that meant and what it would be like to be a person who kind of embarked on these adventures. So then kind of to tell the beginning of my story, where a lot of this story that I'll tell you guys about today starts. I went to Alaska in the summer of 2015, and I was there for the summer solstice. And this is what it looked like in Fairbanks at midnight. Midnight's probably not really actually a good term for it because it looks nothing like the night. But I was really taken during the summer that I was in Alaska with this idea of what the effect the sun has, not only on the environment, but on the people that live there. So the sun didn't set for a month and a half probably while I was in Alaska. And the way that culture and people responded to that was really fascinating to me, that people would stay up all hours of the night and never really go to sleep, and you'd have this amazing sense of energy. And so this experience caused me to be really curious about what the Arctic would be like in the middle of the winter. And so I think really going to Alaska during this summer was kind of the start of this obsession I've had with the polar regions. So when I started thinking in art school, my thesis year was coming up, and I knew I had to do a really large project. I knew I wanted it to go on an expedition, and I know I wanted to go to a polar region. So I was trying any way I could to go back to the Arctic during the polar night, when it was winter, when the sun wasn't going to rise, and experience kind of the opposite end of that spectrum that I had experienced in Alaska. So where I wanted to go is a place called Svalbard. It's a Norwegian territory. It's between 74 and 81 degrees north. And it's really close to the North Pole. Svalbard is up there, kind of outlined in red, and this is just from Google Maps. But Svalbard has a town called, I'm going to pronounce this terribly because my Norwegian's horrible, but Ny-Ålesund, and it's the northernmost permanently settled location on the planet. So Svalbard's really remote, and because it's in the Arctic Circle, it experiences the polar night for a very long time. So I started doing some research before I was getting ready to go on this trip to the Arctic. A visit to the Whaling Museum, which is in New Bedford, when I was much younger. My parents dragged me there, probably. I didn't really want to go. But there are all these amazing paintings of the Arctic from the history of whaling in this region. And so this is a painting by William Bradford called Ice Dwellers Watching the Invaders. And I kept coming back to these images and thinking about the romanticism around Arctic exploration and like, why was I so drawn to this place? Why are humans generally drawn to visiting these really remote regions? And so I started looking at the history of Arctic exploration. And specifically in the 1800s, which was when a lot of this exploration was happening. This was a time when science was becoming professionalized. Queen Victoria had kind of a mission to send a lot of people out all over the world for the purpose of scientific exploration and discovery. So there's all of these trips going to the Arctic during this time period, not only ones that were commissioned by like royalty and by the government, but private ships could also go out. And Queen Victoria had a document written that I stumbled across in my research called A Manual of Scientific Inquiry. And it was basically like the first citizen science manual ever made. It was really cool. I was really excited when I found this like old nerdy document that had basically anyone could take this, go out on their private excursion to the Arctic, and collect data about the environment. So there's a section on geography, astronomy, hydrography, all these different ways that people could start beginning to collect knowledge and create knowledge about the Arctic, which had been largely unexplored by Europeans. So I found this document, this manual, and I was fascinated by it and was like, this is so cool. I can mirror my trip off of these ideas, but also started noticing kind of these contradictions and that there were things that were kind of problematic about it. for me at least. Like all of the contributors were men. There was no women really mentioned in this document. There's a section on ethnography, which is kind of troubling. So I was equally like excited about this part of history, but then also like, what does this mean and why am I also hesitant to kind of dive into this old document? And so these are just some paintings by Arctic explorers of this time. Captain John Ross was a really famous explorer who did a lot of trips to the Arctic for the purpose of finding the North Pole. And I just have a quote in one of the documents that I found before I left, which was really inspirational to me as I kind of set out on this adventure, but to think about the ways that scientific exploration sets up the experience of how you'll experience the landscape. So a lot of the explorers were encouraged to not talk about their subjective narrative, to not really tell their story of going to the Arctic, but to keep all of the documents they made really objective, so we can have like the scientific truth and have this very specific record of what we found under the guise of scientific exploration. So again, this idea of linking back to storytelling, just like with science fiction, like who are telling these stories and how do we tell stories about things that we're learning about. And I'll just read one quote from an article by Erica Barish called Far as the Eye Can Reach, and she wrote a lot about poetry and how Arctic explorers turned to poetry as a way to get out their subjective experience because it was so linked to their experience on this really harsh landscape. And she says, Lyon's poetic self-restraint in 1825 had historical precedent. Like other explorers before and after him, he followed the example set by his employers. The discursive boundaries on Arctic expeditions were established by their search for discoveries, but also in their narrative productions. Unsurprisingly, the narratives explorers published upon their return were dominated by this bias towards scientific observation. So not really any room for personal experience there. And so this was kind of something I chewed on as I was setting out to go on my own trip. And kind of as I mentioned before, and I'll touch back on this again later, but another thing that was bothering me was I wasn't finding any records really of women going and exploring the Arctic until I stumbled upon Josephine Peary. And of course, there was a lot of indigenous communities already in the Arctic. It's not like Europeans were the first ones to go there. So there was, of course, already a lot of women living there. But I was kind of looking for this other voice, like where are these other people that are making these explorations? And Josephine Peary went on a lot of Arctic expeditions and wrote a book called My Arctic Journal. And so she has some really great accounts. But I was really thinking and chewing over this idea about the creation of knowledge and who's going and who's telling the stories and who's sharing the information. So these are just some more photos from her journal, and really to point out that, again, a lot of what I'm talking about is kind of this Western European canon of science, but just to emphasize that, of course, there was lots of people already there that were not European explorers. So now coming on to my expedition to the Arctic, I got really excited to go to Svalbard. I was going in the middle of January when it was going to be completely dark. So I set off with the purpose of planning my trip like one of these scientific expeditions. I was going to take photos every day, make drawings, draw maps, record the sun data. The most fascinating thing was the time at which the sun was rising or actually not rising on Svalbard, and then consequently the hours of the different types of twilight. So I got really into this idea of kind of charting the sun and keeping my own really objective records that were both maps, numbers, charts, but then also these more artistic expressions like drawings, photographs, paintings, etc., poems. And just as another reference photo, I took this from Wikipedia, so you can see how close it was to the North Pole. Svalbard is that thing in the middle of the circle up there. So this was the first day that I got to Svalbard at about noon, completely dark out. There's a university center on Svalbard where a lot of people from all over Scandinavia and Europe come to study. And I heard students be like, it's so light out today. Like, I can't believe how bright it is. Yesterday was so much darker. And I was like, are you looking at the same sky as I am? But so this was the first day I was there around noon. And it might be kind of hard to see on this projection, but this was the second day I was on Svalbard, also around noon. And you might not be able to tell, but there's just like the most subtle shift in light this day. There's just a tiny bit more light in the atmosphere. The next day I was on Svalbard, and this is kind of in the middle of the day. I'm walking out into the town called Longyearbyen and collecting all of my data, taking photographs, and just noticing this really subtle shift in light, like it is actually getting a tiny bit lighter every day. And then, this photo is probably really hard to see, but the next day I went out on a snowshoeing trip, and I could tell that there was more light in the sky. There was this really like dingy blue, grainy kind of feeling in the atmosphere, and this was the first day I could really tell that there was a shift happening. And just, I mean, artistically and scientifically, my brain started going like, what is this happening? What is this color? Just really feeling that subtle shift after having been in complete darkness for a few days. So these are just more photos of us going out on our snowshoeing trip on our little mini expedition out into one of these large U-shaped glacial valleys that characterizes Svalbard. And this is a view of one of the old mines. Svalbard has a really big mining history. So I kind of had this experience of being there and witnessing the complete darkness and things slowly getting lighter and lighter, although the sun still wasn't supposed to rise. And then the very last day I was on Svalbard, I was very sad to leave, but I'm packing up my things. I just had this amazing time collecting all of my data. And I walk out of my hostel, and the sky was just full of light. And it cast this really beautiful purple and pink color over the whole landscape. I could see all these mountains I couldn't see the day before, could see across the fjord, and the whole landscape was just completely transformed. And it was this moment that I'll come back to as really experiencing this shift. But the interesting thing is that the sun actually isn't even rising yet. Still, it won't for another few weeks. But it comes close enough to the horizon at this point in the year that the light bounces off of the ocean and kind of back up into the atmosphere. So this happened for all of like 20 minutes, and then it went away, and it was completely dark again. And this experience had a really kind of profound effect on me and kind of set up the way I continue to think about this landscape. Another photo, you can't see, there are northern lights in that photo. But after this amazing experience on Svalbard, I went back to the mainland of Norway, and I went to a conference called Arctic Frontiers. And this was a climate change conference where people from lots of different countries and regions that have any interest, whether it's like oil or actually have nations within the Arctic, just as a place to kind of talk about all of the issues facing the Arctic. And I won't go through everything I learned. I sat through like a million scientific presentations that I thought were fascinating about methane-eating bacteria that are now being exposed as the Arctic is melting, about birds and how their hormones are being disrupted, about erosion, about how to clean up an oil spill. So I then had this experience of listening to all this science about the landscape that I had just experienced and started making some connections between my experience there and then learning about all of these things that are happening that are changing the ecosystem from a really fundamental level. So the return. I came back to Boston after this trip and had all this data to mine through. All of my photos, which meant I basically spent weeks just looking at photos of all the sled dogs and really missing them because they were adorable. But I also had tons of photos of the light changing. I had all of my notes and observations and knew that I needed to kind of find a way to get this information out and to start sifting through all of it. So the first project I did was I made a series of artist books titled On Enquiry of Science, kind of thinking about this manual that I found before I left. And this was an opportunity I felt like to put not only my voice, but this more subjective experience kind of on the shelves of the library. These books were in MFA Horticultural Hall, so it's the library that is at the Museum of Fine Arts. And I came up with my own call number, so it fit into the Library of Congress classification system. But it was kind of a way for me to like disseminate this information and really like put my experiences on the shelves next to all these other voices and start thinking about what happens when these other voices kind of get into the ways that we learn and know about the world. So these had both the subjective experience, my drawings, poems that I wrote, along with all of that objective stuff like maps and charts and things that I collected as ways to kind of trace my trip through Svalbard. So I made this project and really liked the process, but still felt like I wasn't getting at the science. Like, again, coming back to what inspires me to do a lot of this work is to find ways that art can really help communicate science. And I didn't quite feel like this was doing that. Just a photo of the book on the shelf. So simultaneously, I'm seeing the Arctic all over the news. Like, everywhere you look, that Arctic sea ice is melting, that we're opening up the Arctic for oil exploration, that this is a photo from the New York Times of Greenland just melting in these huge cavernous, like, rivers forming as the glacier's melting. Algae blooming. So all of these things are happening, and I keep coming back to one talk that I heard at the Arctic Frontiers Climate Change Conference, and that was about, again, hard to see in this photo, but these huge algal blooms that they're finding under the Arctic sea ice. And it might be hard to see in this photo, but on a screen there's like these huge swaths of green that are starting to appear around the sea ice. And that's not new. There's algae all over the sea. There's a ton of algae that grow in the Arctic always. But what was new was the time of year that they found this huge algal bloom. So there was a scientist, Dr. Mar Fernandez Mendez, who works at the Norwegian Polar Institute. And her talk was about an expedition in 2015 where they found this huge algal bloom like in April, which is really early. This star on this map is like where they found this algal bloom, and this is Svalbard. And so I started thinking about why this is happening and was really curious to find out more. And this is a slide I took from Kate Lowry, who's at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. I also worked with them and kind of talked with them a lot over the last year to answer some more of my questions about this kind of rabbit hole of research I went down. But one of the reasons a bloom like this could be possible is because, as we all know, the Arctic is changing. This is what the old Arctic looked like, with huge, thick slabs of ice that built up over many years. And now we're seeing these huge melt ponds forming in really thin first-year ice. So this idea really caught my attention, and I wanted to keep working with that. So I tried a few different ways to make this happen. I was making paintings about sea ice, and then became really obsessed with sea ice diatoms, which are these ancient organisms. They're algae, they're a type of phytoplankton, and they grow under the sea ice, so like on the edge at the bottom of the sea ice and in the water column. So I started painting these guys and then editing them in Photoshop, and I made a whole series of my own slides just to kind of bring an awareness to these species that are so important for the functioning of the whole ecosystem. And again, I was really drawn to them because they're this fundamental point in the ecosystem. They're the very base of the food chain. Other organisms like this, the Mysilibellula, they eat them. This is a copepod that's really important for nitrogen transport in the Arctic Ocean. So as I was trying to visualize these changes, I did all of this research on my own and was kind of poking and prodding at different ways that I could show or talk about it or just find more ways to communicate it. And so that kind of the whole food chain goes all the way up to the polar bear, right? Like, these algae are so important to everything, including us. And what this all comes back to was that experience I had on Svalbard of witnessing the light changing in a really subtle way. So actually the amount of light in the sky didn't change that much, but the effect it had on me was really profound, and like this really profound moment. And I started making the connections about how not only my own connections, but through that thinning ice has a profound effect on the algae that are underneath. So I will show you an animation I made, and we'll just watch it while I talk a little bit. So I got really interested in these sea ice diatoms. This is a species called Thalassiosira nordenskiolii, and it is one of the species that the N Ice expedition found growing these huge blooms. And as I was kind of describing earlier, they're the base of the food chain, so they're really important to the way the rest of the Arctic Ocean functions. And as as I was doing my research, I found this group in Norway that was studying polar night biology, and like that word just got me really excited right off the bat. But for a long time, we thought that the Arctic Ocean was dormant during the winter, that there wasn't a lot happening, that because it was completely dark, most of the organisms weren't really doing much. And what this team based out of Tromsø in Norway has been finding is that, in fact, the Arctic Ocean is highly productive during the winter. There's just kind of a reverse structure. And it's not functioning the way, sorry, I'm just gonna have some water, the same way that it does in the summer. And so they did all these expeditions going out into the Arctic in the middle of the winter and kind of found all these seminal studies about zooplankton that were really active and how moonlight, even the slight changes of light from moonlight, drive activity in the ocean in the middle of the winter. And so I wanted to make this animation showing how this one organism kind of multiplies out of control and how important that is for the rest of the ecosystem. So I made this animation and was still kind of thinking about all of these ways that we can visualize or represent scientific concepts, but still felt like what was missing was that subjective experience, the feeling of being in the darkness, what it feels like to be in the Arctic in the middle of the winter. And so I was really searching for ways to talk about this that kind of went out of the 2D and into the 3D. So these organisms keep multiplying and they bloom out of control, which is what they had been finding under the sea ice. And so what I decided to do was make an installation, and I kept coming back to this idea of a laboratory and the idea that knowledge is something that is created and or discovered. Kept like finding this over and over as I was reading. And I really kind of clung on to that idea that knowledge is this thing that we create, essentially. And if I could create a space in which people can start to create their own visceral experiential knowledge of something, I could maybe start making work that would kind of appeal more to that emotional side of things. So as with any research question, once I started looking into these sea ice diatoms, I went down this like rabbit hole of research and realized that I couldn't really take any one thing like this algal bloom out of context, that there are so many interconnections that I really need to try and represent the system or the whole complex network of different things that are happening, as we know happens in an ecosystem. So I modeled this after the idea of a laboratory, but inside of this space, everything that's there is an art object or a drawing or a painting or an animation. So different pieces thinking about the thickness of sea ice and what effect snow and sea ice thickness have on the ocean. This piece was modeled after images I'd seen of sea ice cores, and then that screen in the background is a piece that changes really slowly, and they're colors that I sampled from the photographs I took when I was on Svalbard. So it's kind of chasing this idea of the light changing really slowly and what that looks like when it's spilling into this laboratory environment. A piece thinking about melt ponds and how can I show that the more melt ponds we have on the ice, it accelerates the process of sea ice melting. So I found all of these things, like I couldn't just take the sea ice algae out and make something about that because it was so connected to all of these other changes that are happening as the planet warms. So these were Petri dishes, and I was just again thinking about this process of experimentation and how to represent the landscape, these really subtle shifts on the landscape. And so I was pretty happy with my installation. Like I thought it came out well, and I really created a space, hopefully, that people could experience some of these changes in like a visual way. There was an audio piece, so I wanted people to be able to experience things through all senses. But what really ended up happening to me at the end of this project, which I think is what happens with any good project, is that I had more questions than I felt like I had answered anything. Yes, I had made all this work trying to visualize the Arctic, but I kept coming back to that idea about knowledge and about who's creating knowledge and who's telling a story. Ooh, I didn't think that was, sorry. So let's see, how much time do we have? Okay, so I will just play a short clip. This is documentation of the Thesis installation, just so you can see what it looked like in 3D and hear a little bit of the audio that I made to go in the installation.
And intensify the melting process. The crust
Can you guys
of
see
the
it?
Arctic Ocean is disappearing. Inevitably, life underneath is shifting and becoming destabilized. Organisms most experience
Okay, so I'll stop the video there. But what I kind of was trying to do with the sound was to connect some of the dots of other things that were happening in the installation, and I got to use a lot of recordings I found from the Antarctic Underwater Observatory. So again, trying to find ways to like integrate this data and recordings that were taken in the field into the installation. So coming back to one of my first questions about who tells our stories and who the keepers of knowledge are, at the end of this whole process, what I really found was that I had all these questions about truth and about the scientific process and how we kind of arrive at these conclusions and get to a lot of this information. And the thing that I think art can do really well is I can both advocate for science in a project, but also kind of critique that process. And so I think that when we add science to art, it makes art better. And I hope that when we kind of put science through this process, that we do an art of critiquing everything, we can ask, like, what are the lineages of knowledge? Who's collecting the data? And both advocate for science that's creating a positive story about how we need to change the way we behave in order to impact the environment in a better way, but also kind of ask those questions about how we can make science better. And whose voices are we putting out there to tell the full story of what's happening. So this summer, I was a Thai graduate environmental research fellow. So I went to Montana and was doing a research project about contemporary environmental art. And this piece was a piece by a Northern Cheyenne artist named Bentley Spang. And he made this piece about water quality on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. And this was an example to me of, I thought, a really great way that we can kind of marry the scientific, Western scientific perspective with an indigenous knowledge base. So he made this piece very much in his own perspective and personal relationship to water and water quality. And the piece was kind of supplemented with a tour of a nearby wetland. So kind of at the end of my whole Arctic installation, I'm now thinking a lot about these ideas of voice and whose voices and how can we combine different types of voices to come up with the best, most comprehensive stories. And so that leaves me to see if you guys have any questions.
Questions for Isabel?
Yeah.
You had talked about how when you were in Alaska and it was completely light outside, and then when you got to, I'm not going to pronounce the name of it, and it was very dark, and how people were saying, like, oh, the light's coming back, and how this was, like, affecting the community at large. Do you have any sense of what it's like to be in one of these places when it is getting dark, and you have this, like, is that a sense of impending doom, or sort of, like, it's going to be bad, or is it also treated with just, like, this is what happens, and we'll deal with it?
That's a really good question. I think for me, as someone who's never actually lived in that type of environment for an extended period of time, I would have a sense of doom that, like, oh gosh, the darkness is coming. But I've been to Norway a couple times, like, during this dark period, not quite to the extent that I went to Svalbard. And I think it seemed to me as, like, a total outsider that culturally people have kind of figured ways around that to, like, make everything really cozy, and there's, like, cute little twinkling lights everywhere, and so I think culturally people adapt to that. But I'm actually going back to Norway this November, so I'll get back to you, because it will be in that period where it's, like, getting super dark. But there's also what's called the blue season, especially I know for sure it happens in the spring, and I'm sure there's something similar in the fall, that as the light's coming back and before the sun is actually rising and there's real daylight, there's like a 2-month period of that blue color, like everything's just blue. So, I mean, I think it's really fascinating, but yeah, good question. Yeah.
Well, I'll pick up on that question. I do some work in the Arctic with Inuit communities in northern Canada, and in that part of the Arctic, there's a real seasonality to research. And I wonder, because I have never been to Svalbard, since you were there in the middle of winter, is there a busy research season in Svalbard and a slow research season, and how does that relate to light?
Absolutely. So from what I gathered, and again, not as like an insider there, they're definitely really busy in the summer. There's a lot of student cruises that go out, but they also were really busy in the winter. I think after these studies were coming out, and I think I'm going to get the date wrong, I think they were in like 2008, where they really started to figure out there was a lot happening in the winter. Now there's like entire student courses you can take where you spend 6 weeks out on a vessel. So there's a lot of trips that are going out in the middle of the winter now that there's the technology and like the interest and the desire to know more. Because I think one of the biggest things they realized was like there's so much we don't know about the Arctic Ocean in the middle of the winter that we need to like find out before it changes. So it seems to me like the winter's now a very busy time, at least on Svalbard, because there's the university center, and then Ny-Ålesund is a completely scientific research community. Like everybody that's in this other small town are all researching. So, yeah.
That might be an interesting follow-up piece to your research or to your art and exploration. In Canada, it's still much busier in the summer, and so the Inuit communities really like the winter because it's quiet and they don't have all of these visitors coming, and they can be more sort of family-oriented at that time. So especially with the historic part of the work that you've done, I think that would be really interesting to explore a bit more.
Really interesting.
I'm just curious if you have investigated or represented any other environmental issues through art, or if you're planning to do that in the future.
Yeah.
And if so, which issues?
Well, most recently this summer, I am interested in like a lot of different issues. I got kind of really caught up in the Arctic with this project, but I did a project this summer on irrigation in southwestern Montana. So a drought, like I'm really interested in a lot of things related to water, I guess, is kind of becoming one of the major themes in my work. But southwestern Montana has been experiencing a drought for a long period of time. And so I was able to do a project this summer on mapping the irrigation system in this one county in Montana and creating a piece that's about the history of the development of the irrigation system. So when the land was settled in like the 1800s and the land grab, the first people to get their claim have the earliest water right year, which I know that term is also kind of like brings up a lot of other questions. But so I made a piece this summer about how the year that the parcel of land gained its water right relates to how long in the season that irrigator has access to water. So if you have a water right from a very recent year, your water could get shut off in like July or the end of June. And so what does that do to the communities and people having to work together? So yeah, other projects that I'm interested in, definitely a lot to do with water, but irrigation and more to come for sure. In Gallatin County.
Oh, what's that?
Yeah.
I just have a question. It's about audience. When you make your work, which by the way I find very captivating, do you have a certain audience in mind or not? And if so, who is that audience?
Yeah. I generally think about trying to reach people who might not be interested in some of these issues yet. But I think what I've been finding is that the people that I connect most with already kind of know something about it. And so that's something I'm kind of dealing with. Like, who am I making this work for? And if anyone connects with it, that makes me happy. But it's a good question and definitely one to consider. So.
Hi, Isabel.
Hi, Nathan.
Good to see you
You
again.
too.
I really enjoy your work. My question is, can you share some responses, interesting responses you got to for your work? Does it make any change in people's mind, and does it educate them about climate change and so on?
Yeah, I got a range of responses. There was definitely some just like, it was cool, but I didn't really get it. You know, there was that. Some people told me it made them feel really sad, which I actually liked that response. I didn't think I would, but I was like, you should feel sad. It's so sad. And then I think for some people it sparked kind of a new interest in these things. What I also had in my thesis installation was like as if you were to go to a museum. I had a listing that had the different pieces in the installation, because they were all about something specific, like either they're about melt ponds or algae or sea ice cores or and so I had a little sheet that for people who were interested, they could read more, and I would kind of lay out what it was about in case those connections weren't pretty clear. So I got a wide range. And some people said they learned a lot. Like, I think if they really read, I think the writing helped. If they really read about it, they learned something new. So, yeah.
Following up on that question, what do the scientists think?
They really like it, the ones I've talked to. I also collaborated with or worked with Larry Pratt, who's a researcher at Woods Hole, and he's done some work in the Arctic. And for him, it was really exciting. And I was constantly worried about representing the science well, like not messing something up, not getting something wrong. And he, as a researcher, as a scientist, was like, well, I'm more interested in your perspective, and like I'm more interested in how you can make this into like an aesthetic project or make me feel something. So and then in Montana this summer, I wasn't talking with as many scientists, but I talked with a lot of people from the agricultural community and the irrigators who were like using the irrigation system, and they responded really well to that piece. So yeah, so I think there's something about like having a connection to maybe the subject matter already that really helps people get on board and feel connected.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Nice to meet everyone.